We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Hey Gaia, what are we talking about today?
So today, I wanted to make a case for why should you play retro games. So this kind of came up a bit actually yesterday. I'm going to admit this is a very recent development in the game topics. I was scrolling through our wonderful source extra credits and their backlog of videos from up to 10 years ago. And I saw that we had covered the first 100 videos that I saw listed, we had covered to some form in our previous episodes. And then I saw this one just kind of hiding in that list that was the case for the classics. Why should you play retro games? And I loved that as a topic. I watched the video, went through it pretty quickly and was like, yeah, I want to talk about that.
Cool.
And then did like an hour of research on the side to kind of
Flesh it out a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to be running through this episode as a series of questions. And the ultimate goal is to say, okay, should you play classic games? Now, we're not talking like modern Fortnite as a topic here. We're not talking about big names like even Persona 5, which has entered into the show quite a few times now. But this is more, why should you play the original Mario or Pokemon Red or the old Mega Man games or even games from the 90s and early 2000s like Jak and Daxter, for example.
Right.
And this is really, why should you play the old games that might be a bit outdated in graphics, a little bit clunky, having systems that maybe didn't stand the test of time? Why should you go back and play these old games? And we're going to be doing this as a series of questions. So we're going to be talking about books a little bit before really diving into why should we play these old games and how does playing these old games help us in terms of game design. And that's pretty much everything. So I'm going to be throwing this over to you, Vi, pretty early on and ask, let's think about books for a second. Let's think about literature, poetry, novels, anything that you feel from the whole scene of writing. Why should someone read classic books?
Classic books are a fun place to start this because it puts classic games and classic books in the same level, which I think is a little bit funny. But classics, a lot of the time, have common themes that are relatable today, even if the stories are a little bit more out of touch. And a lot of the basic elements of really good stories, and especially really good popular stories now, are based on classics or evolve from them, right? Like we can think about, stuff like Don Quixote being the first sort of novelization of like a popular novel, and a popular series. And we can go from there and draw a line to, whatever thing you just picked up at Chapters yesterday. So even though the context they're written in is different, and they'll always be understood in the context of their own time, and when you read a classic, you pull it out of its own time because you're not gonna you're not gonna know necessarily that something is a reference to a joke, right? Like imagine like little Trump jokes that end up in some novelizations today. Like readers, 100 years from now might not get that.
They hopefully in 100 years they won't even know who that is.
Yeah, that would be cool.
That'd be cool.
So they're often like distilled, focused versions of those specific topics, lessons, and themes, especially today when they're removed from their context. And so by getting that focus, you get to learn how and why those specific techniques were effective rather than, being engaged in the context of your own time, of which modern books are written in.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. One way that I kind of have had this written down is like, you get to ignore, like when reading through these classics and going through these older books that have stood the test of time, you get to see, okay, why was this so popular? Why did this work? What about it works? And even how does this reappear in books today? Mm-hmm. There's a really good example of this in the entire genre of fantasy. If you go back and read literally two series, Lord of the Rings and Narnia, which are both like early to mid 1900s. So all you have to read.
Literally written by two guys who were like best friends.
Yeah, and utterly hated each other's books.
Yeah.
Actually liked each other's books, but found they were a bit not what they would write.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope that's obvious.
Which is how best friends should work. It's like, this is very cool. It's not my thing, though.
It's not my thing. This is cool, though.
Equal and opposite. Why do you have a lantern in the middle of the woods? Yes, Lewis
Just
is
to
like,
spite you.
Just to spite you. Fuck like, fuck you. I'm gonna because did you know that Treebeard is based on C.S. Lewis?
Yes.
Yeah, so like, fuck you. I'm gonna make you a tree. You talk too much and you're slow.
But if you go back and read these books and then start reading more modern fantasy titles, even such as like George Martin with, what does he write? A Song of Ice and Fire. Mm-hmm. I always think of it by the name Game of Thrones, which is not really how he called it.
Yeah, not the name of the series.
But even more modern fantasy stuff like Skyrim as a video game and all the books based on it, or even modern sci-fi like Star Wars.
Yeah.
All of these can be traced back to these two fantasy series as a foundation, and you can see why they work so well, right? This huge focus on character development and character design, this massive worlds with like deep lore and different languages and aspects, and even some key elements like elves live in trees and dwarves in the mines.
But also really common themes about war and what that means, because both C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were involved in World War One.
Yeah, and both deeply traumatized by it.
Both deeply traumatized by it. And so when you read it as the context of like, this is a retelling of your experience in World War One, those become very different books.
And it's also wild reading modern books written on fantasy, and they're basing a lot of their work off of these people who saw war and are writing about war, but these authors didn't.
Yes.
And it kind of comes back to this same ultimate theme, this another big aspect of it's sometimes hard to know what makes a story good when there's just so much stuff in it, right? How did I write this here in my notes? It's like, you can imagine a lot of the books that we read today are not going to stand the test of time, and sometimes miss some of these key elements. Like, there's some great authors out there, like James Patterson or Sarah J. Maas as current modern writers, but their books, admittedly, are not going to become classics, right? And quite often you have to ask, what did they miss? And if you were just to analyze these books and say what's good about them, you might get bogged down by the millions of other things that are in modern writing. But if you go back and read Lord of the Rings or Narnia, it's very easy to see these very specific elements that were so successful.
Yeah, what key ideas did they hold that are going to stand the test of time?
Yeah.
Right? What clarity are they writing with? I had a conversation recently with somebody who we talked about we were talking about journaling, but it all came back to like the reason you do something is more important than doing it, right? Why are you keeping a journal? Who is it for? What is the point? And the why for Tolkien and Lewis was, to understand like what escape feels like. Right?
Yeah.
And to that effect, and to sort of work, and maybe not on purpose, to work through what they had gone through in World War One. Whereas maybe Sarah J. Maas and James Patterson didn't do that, right? They went, why? To be entertaining, which is also a really good reason to write.
Yeah, but it's completely different from their basis.
From things that are considered classics.
Yeah. And like a way that I kind of think about it is if you're studying to be an author, you're studying how to write well, or even just finding good books to read, how can you determine what books will stand the test of time when the author is still writing books?
This is the question everybody wants to know. What's the new modern classic?
Yeah. And there's no good answer to that. They haven't stood the test of time yet. How will you know if they will?
And this is also a difficult question to ask about games.
Yes.
Right? Because a lot of games and books are classics because they were popular.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm thinking about like how popular Jane Austen books were, and that's why they've stood the test of time. But like, I don't know many people who have actually read Pride and Prejudice, but they know the story because of the movie.
Yeah.
Right? Or movies, plural, or TV show, depending on what your favorite version of that is.
Or others who have read it and talked about it.
Exactly.
Or the books based on it.
Yeah.
Right? And
they've watched retellings.
Yeah. And it comes back to these books have already stood the test of time. If you're looking for what makes a book good and what makes a book stand the test of time, you're not going to get it from the books that haven't. Right? I look back at like what books have become classics and have become cornerstones of their genre. We've mentioned Lord of the Rings for fantasy, but George Orwell with the dystopia genre, writing 1984 and Animal Farm, or his teacher, I can't remember his name now, who wrote Brave New World, right? Both huge classics in the dystopia and utopia genres, though calling Brave New World a utopia is a little bit of a stretch, but that was the point. It was utopian, right? Or you could also think of, like, again, Jane Austen with Pride and Prejudice, or Hemingway with, I asked my friend what their favorite book was, and they're like, you shouldn't say this one, but they said The Old Man and the Sea.
Yeah.
And they were like,
fair.
that one's not very popular, but it's my favorite. I'm like, you know what?
Look,
I think you deserve respect. I'm
My
putting on a
favorite
show.
Hemingway is A Movable Feast, and that's so divorced from every other kind of writing that he's done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? So we really get at the core of why should you read classic books? Well, first, if you're trying to write or understand what makes good, like books good, you should go read the provably good books.
Yes. But if you're also interested in writing a book in that genre, you have an idea for a fantasy book, go read the foundation, go read the foundational novel of that genre,
Yeah.
right? There's I don't remember where this is from. It's one of those internet quotes, but thinking of writing in fantasy as, how in Japanese paintings, Mount Fuji is always there. And you can think of Tolkien the same way, as you are either facing the mountain or you are facing away from the mountain, right? So you've either made a choice because it's always there, or you've made a choice to turn your back to it, right? So you can write,
But you can
write
choice.
to the opposite of Tolkien, right? But you've made that choice, or it's not in the image because you're standing on top of it, right? So it's either near, far, not in the picture, or you're standing on top of it, and that's how you can think of a lot of classic novels.
Yeah. And one thing that we're going to be talking about a bit later is there's also the question of how did tropes develop? Why do these tropes exist? Why are there common patterns in modern writing? And if you know how they developed and where they come from, you can now play into them or play against them, right? Do elves always have to live in trees or these forest kind of nature areas? Do dwarves always have to live in the mountains? Are orcs always the bad guys? Well, if you just played Shadow of Mordor being based on Lord of the Rings, or played modern D&D, or played modern adaptations, it might be really hard to answer that question of how do we change that in a way that's meaningful. But if you go back to the original Lord of the Rings, well, orcs are like this because they were created by an evil guy to do evil things, and that's it, right? They're the evil minion trope that we have today, but back then that wasn't a trope. That was a new thing,
Yeah.
right? Elves were in forests because that's how Tolkien thought about the concept of ultimate beauty. Right?
Yeah.
So you want to make a new version of elves. They don't have to be in forests, but they have to be the epitome of ultimate beauty.
But
as
again,
its theme.
it's a new version of elves. It's not its own thing.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna actually read this quote properly because I did a pretty poor job of paraphrasing it. It's Sir Terry Pratchett's quote, which is great. J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears in so many Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close. Sometimes it's a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist has either made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
But I do want to throw one more thing out here as well of when it comes to reading the classics. It's not just enough to read Lord of the Rings, right? That's still popular to this day. I think Amazon's making a new show on it, unless that got canceled.
Like another one?
Okay, maybe this came out and I didn't know it had come out.
Rings of Power?
Yes.
Yeah, it's out.
Oh. Good to know. Cool. I don't watch shows. But think about if you had just read Lord of the Rings as an attempt to understand the fantasy genre. Even though it is a classic, as I've already said, you'd find elves and trees, doors and mines. But is this what makes the Lord of the Rings and fantasy as a whole good? Is it enough to just read Lord of the Rings? What about C.S. Lewis and George Martin, two authors we've already talked about in this genre?
Yes, and you have to remember that Tolkien was an Oxford professor who was well versed in the classics.
Yes, he
right? was well versed in
the classics.
Was well versed in his classics. So you have to think about when you are creating something in a modern space.
Yeah,
that it's important that you understand where it's coming from.
Yeah, and kind of continuing on from here, it's as you read, you'd identify a large, mystical, expansive world in these novels. You'd find a deep story and a key theme of character development, like Lord of the Rings, Narnia, all these are stories about characters, not actually about the world. The world exists to build the characters, and that's a cornerstone of fantasy as a genre, right? It's about how the world beats them down and how they grow or collapse under it, right? That's the story of Boromir in Lord of the Rings, but I won't spoil that too far for those who haven't read, right? It's not enough to cast Fireball and put you in medieval city B. Although so much fantasy today says medieval setting, that's needed for fantasy. Well, why? Because Tolkien's works were all about a beautiful, expansive world, about the world. He didn't want to weigh it down with technology and all of these modern city design things. He wanted hobbits in cool holes and these wooded cities of the elves and underground mines because he wanted a cool, expansive, unique world.
Yeah.
So how
Well,
could you
and
make a unique world?
he was also making a comment on capitalists in the industrial state. So
Oh, always.
So it's based on the context of your time. And this isn't to say that if you're going to go write something or make a game now that you have to go learn everything, right? You don't have to read all of Tolkien and then all of everything, the Fall of Numenor, like Gondor. Like, no.
Don't have to go through the Unfinished Tales. Don't have to
do
go through
it.
Silmarillion.
You don't have to, right? It's enough for you to understand that, hey, these tropes are from somewhere. And if you understand when you're encountering a trope in your own writing and whether or not you choose to lean into it or subvert it, which is also great, that you just are aware of that, right?
Yeah, that it's intentional, not accidental.
Intentional, not accidental, which is something we talk about in game design a lot, is that shift between, when something is good, it's because that element has been thought about and you only notice in its lack.
Yeah.
And that's huge when we talk about just writing for an audience, right?
And it's often very hard to answer the question, what is the story missing?
Yeah. Like, genuinely one of the hardest things as somebody who writes, sometimes I will put a story away because I'm like, this is missing something and I don't know what it is and I can't identify it. So it's gone because I don't think it's good enough, right? Like, and it's genuinely a very, very challenging thing to do. And when you're trying to also add mechanics from a game, right? When your medium isn't only text,
there's the narrative but also the visuals and the music.
Yes, and now you're engaging with directly how somebody experiences that story, and if you're doing like choices matter stuff, now you have to think about decisions. You have to think about decision trees and thinking about like how does that change the story as the player encounters it. That's a huge question.
The Baldur's Gate 3 dilemma.
Yeah, right? Like, I was thinking about Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah,
but
imagine just playing Baldur's Gate 3 and then trying to make your own fantasy game. What makes Baldur's Gate 3 good?
Yeah.
That is a hard question.
It's a hard question to ask, right?
But if you go play Baldur's Gate 2, you might actually start to catch on to what made these games good.
Yes. And important, I think, when we talk about should you play classics, Baldur's Gate 3 is the good one. There were an iterative 2 before that.
Yep, and their expansions or side games.
Which were not critically acclaimed, as far as I know.
Yeah, they were considered cult classics.
Exactly. So when you talk about a classic, if you're going to go back and play one, I think it's important that you know, was it astounding for the time? Because I don't think you'll have the same experience playing it now as people did then.
Yeah.
It's the Star Wars dilemma.
It is the Star Wars dilemma.
The special effects were really, really good then, right? Like the first movie had the most sound effects ever in a movie. Ever. Period, right? And I remember when I was a kid asking my dad, like, hey, were these good when this came out?
Yeah, were they good like 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Because it looks aged. And he was like, well, it looked the same way, but it was the first time you had seen something like that, right? Or with this sort of feel to it. Right, and that's what made it important, was it was the first one to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's really dig into these questions for games. We understand why reading modern or classic books are so important to being a modern reader or a modern writer. So how does this apply to games? We're going to be answering 3 questions in this process, and I want to launch off with the first one since we're already kind of talking about it. How does playing classic games help us in learning to make modern games? So I want to start this off by discussing my most hated genre that exists, and it's survival games.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no,
I was like, what hot take is this going to be?
I hate. Don't worry. I also hate battle royale games. Hate both those genres. But let's talk about survival games.
Okay.
I have played a lot of survival games so far. I have touched on Rust and Ark, though I don't own them. I've just kind of played them on the side, right? I have played Valheim. I've played Minecraft Terraria, some of the big names, Don't Starve, and I've played a lot of small ones that I don't even remember the name of because they didn't stand the test of time. And
the test of even your personal time.
Yeah, the test of 5 years.
Yeah. The test of you remembering what the game was called.
Yep, I could open my Steam, but I don't want my computer to start screaming like last time.
Yay.
So why are survival games so popular? And as someone who doesn't like survival games, that was actually a really hard question for me to ask. And I was thinking about, okay, what are some of the modern ones I've played? Like Vampire Survivor, whatever that game's called, right? I was like, well, they tend to have crafting. They tend to have really wild, hostile environments. And they usually have the ability to kind of shape the world around you. But why did I not enjoy Valheim? What about that did I not like? Like, what was that missing? What was that vampire game missing? What was Ark missing and Rust missing? And I was like, okay.
And again, I think just important to sort of hedge this. Important for you.
Yeah,
Yes.
but not just for me, but like I felt like something was missing from these games, even as a genre. So I said, okay, what are they missing? And I couldn't answer that question when analyzing them. So I was like, okay, well, what are the old classics of the survival genre that has shaped these games? And I landed on 3 games. I first landed on Minecraft, and I asked, what makes Minecraft good? And it's really, from what I can tell, the ability to shape the world around you and build anything you want. It's the creative freedom. I was like, okay, that answers a big question. It's this massive creative freedom in building a world, but not all survival games do that. So what else works? The next one I identified was Don't Starve, which is basically the non-stop terror of surviving a night.
Yeah.
Which is, in Don't Starve, that is impossible, basically. Like, I have died on night 1 in Don't Starve so many times, right? But it's that difficulty, that challenge of just surviving one night and, like, beating the odds was huge for that. And then I landed on Terraria, which is this massive level of personal creativity, having all the items and builds and combos, and, again, that ability to shape the world, but also just this, you can build and do anything. So when thinking about survival games, I said, what does Valheim and Rust and Ark miss? And the answer was often first, it didn't focus in on one of these 3 themes. These 3 themes made these 3 games good, do all 3, and okay, you're doing what makes survival games good, and you're doing none of them well.
Yeah.
That was actually my issue with Valheim in particular. Despite the fact that it is a fun game, it was this, like, I constantly felt like I had nothing. I constantly felt like everything I did didn't really matter, right? And a lot of these games also were really focused on, let's throw you in the woods and give you nothing, and you have to go from the beginning to the end of, like, technological development on your own. And I'm like, well, that's what Terraria does. It's what Don't Starve does. It's what Minecraft does. But that's not why those games are good. Actually, that's the part I don't like in those games, right? That's the part that sucks. I would love to start in a world and be a citizen in a city working my way up.
Sure.
Right? So, but what makes these games good is the creativity and freedom that comes from survival games, or the challenge. I think Pokemon makes a really good example for this too. And it's actually a lot easier to analyze Pokemon. Have you played a recent Pokemon game, or have you seen a recent Pokemon game?
I have not.
So modern Pokemon games are massive open world expanses with full character customization, editing, like some of them even allow you to edit the clothing on your Pokemon, though that's not, the most recent ones don't have that, right? They let you catch hundreds of Pokemon if you want. They have full tutorials, like massive cities and big worlds, and you can do anything you want, right? Why is Pokemon fun? If you were to play these games, I don't think you'd have an answer to that question. But just asking you, Vi, someone who's probably played the old Pokemon games as well, or knows about them, what makes Pokemon fun?
I think there's an element of exploration to those games that's really rewarding. I honestly didn't play Pokemon when I was a kid.
That's fair.
Like, I mean, that's it. The closest contact I've had with Pokemon is Pokemon Go in, like, 2016. That's it.
When I looked back at some old Pokemon games. Pokemon Red, Pokemon Emerald, and Pokemon Go as a more recent example. And I asked, why do people like these games? And I landed on 3 things. Catching cool guys, watching them grow and get better, and then strategically fighting other cool guys.
That is how a Pokemon game works, yeah.
But if you were to play a modern Pokemon game, would you identify the battling as the most fun aspect? Well, you'd probably identify meeting the cool, eccentric gym leaders as the most fun aspect, or exploring the big open world, but that's not core to the experience. That's how Pokemon's developed. But you can even see what didn't survive the test of time in Pokemon. And we're going to get into that a little bit later as well, but the only things that have lasted from the original games are those 3 features.
Yeah, I think it says a lot when you look at the evolution of a particular type of game, and you can see what was added for novelty and then what was removed because it wasn't, it didn't hold up.
Yeah, and this lets you ask why games like Temtem failed, or other Pokemon clones. Hell, even why Ni no Kuni, a game that I loved made by Studio Ghibli, why the worst aspect of it was the Pokemon aspect. And it's because they didn't have this hard focus on catching cool guys, watching them grow, and really getting you to have that bond with them.
Catching cool guys.
And then even when they let you catch cool guys, it's not about the fact that you catch cool guys. There's no gotta catch them all, which Pokemon's also abandoned that slogan, by the way.
Oh, really? That's kind of a shame.
Well, because now you can't catch them all. There's over 1,000 Pokemon.
There's too many.
There's way too many.
Nintendo went, you know what? This isn't a realistic tagline.
They haven't had a game with all the Pokemon in it in like 5 years.
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
Right? But this is true for fantasy games as well. This whole aspect of boiling things down. Like, Like we talked about Baldur's Gate 3. Imagine trying to pick out what makes Baldur's Gate 3 good.
Yeah.
Well, what does Baldur's Gate 3 have? Thousands of items, dozens upon dozens of unique characters.
Yeah. But the key thing that everybody likes is the relationship with your companions.
Yeah.
Right? That's gotta, like, when I talk about Baldur's Gate 3 with people, that is the one thing that comes up.
Yeah, actually, It's the exact same thing that was about Tolkien's writing that made it so good.
Wow.
It's a story about characters and how they respond to the world around them.
Yeah, and I think you, like, watching actual play D&D, even you have this, right? A lot of the time, there are moments where I will turn off an actual play because I'm like, they're just fighting something. Who cares? But I want the role play moments, right? I'm there when there are two people being vulnerable. I'm like, tell me everything about what's going on here.
Yeah.
Right? And that's, like, we're people. That's the thing that we want, is connections with people. We want to see that. We want to be part of it.
Yeah. And it's like, if you were to go back and play games like the original Legend of Zelda and Earthbound and like the really old fantasy classic games, you'd see, a fun combat system, an expansive world with unique regions, a compelling story, and especially from like Earthbound, big character development and this unique character interactions. The whole story of Gygas in Earthbound, or maybe Mother 1 it was, right? Like, you don't, like, those are key to the fantasy genre. But if you were to play Breath of the Wild, you might not notice that.
Yeah.
Breath of the Wild, its whole thing is that creativity. It's the survival thing that makes Breath of the Wild fun. Because it's already built on the back of this really solid fantasy background.
I would argue that Breath of the Wild is successful because its story is so good.
That's true. The story is really good in Breath of the Wild.
And, there is elements of survival that are very good, but as soon as you're past the, like, grind for, like, I need a stick, and now I've killed something and I need another stick, once you're past that bit, you're really into the heart of the game, and it's no longer about survival. It's just, you could play a lot of that game and not fight stuff.
Yeah. So that kind of answers, how does playing the classics help in game development? So I kind of want to jump to the next question. I know I've completely skipped the topic of battle royales because,
oh no,
end of the day, didn't really want to talk about battle royales. Don't want to talk about Fortnite. What makes Fortnite good? Is it the 100,000 collabs you have to pay $20 for a skin? No, it's the aspect of
really
this constant tension. It's the constant tension.
Yes.
But anyways, the next question is, how does playing classic games help us understand the development of games? So not making games, but like the history of games, how games have developed from the starting point, right? We talked about a big thing in reading books being, when you read these classic books, you see, where did this all begin? Why was this successful? How is it developed? How do our modern books mirror the old ones, and how were those old ones commentary of their time? Yeah. George Orwell in 1984 wasn't trying to predict a police state. He was trying to say they already lived in one.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. It's the thing of like, The Simpsons predicted this. And it's like, well, no. They were making a comment on themes they were already seeing.
Yeah. They weren't predicting the future. They were commenting on the present.
And it turns out that their present is our past, and so the thing has come to pass.
Yeah. Right? So, like, looking back on Pokemon, we can ask the question of, okay, how has Pokemon developed? Well, let's take a look at things that have been removed from Pokemon over the course of the games. They removed the day-night cycle. They removed the concept of diving to, like, go into an underwater realm.
That's a shame.
Right?
That sounds really good.
It was kind of like riding a Pokemon underwater with puzzles, except it was way more boxed in, like a maze. Kind of sucked.
Wow. Okay.
They removed the entire underground from Generation 4. They removed contests from Generation 3 and 4, and those are some of my favorite aspects, but I can see why they got rid of them, right? They removed the slogan of catching them all. They removed the whole national dex. Like, those are some big things that people like that are gone now, but what worked? What did they keep? They kept a solid battle system. They kept raising your Pokemon, interacting with them personally. They added even more ways. Like, the newest Pokemon game has the ability to control your Pokemon running around in like a forest full of other Pokemon.
They've Tamagotchi'd your Pokemon.
They've Tamagotchi'd your Pokemon, right? They kept the idea of a unique set of gyms and a unique environment for like each step you're in. They kept the same storyline plot, the whole beat 7 gyms, go catch the main legendary, then go beat the 8 gym, and now have the huge task of beating the Elite Four, right? They kept an even simplistic but solid story, and that's what works. Yeah. How has Pokemon developed? Well, let's look at what didn't work, let's look at what did work, and let's take Pokemon Red, that dumpster fire of a game that it is, and compare it to modern Pokemon games, and you see, that's how it developed. So what are they going to do next? How do we learn from that? right? I see the same thing in Undertale with Earthbound that I've already talked about. Earthbound was great for its time, but what was Earthbound good at? They were good at big character development, amazing emotional soundtracks that fit the scene. Remember when we did how do you tell a story through world building music, one of our first episodes? That's what Earthbound did. That's what Undertale did, right? They focused on fun dialogue and traits, more visual interaction, wacky antics. This whole theming, this very intense theming is what shaped this early kind of fantasy style genre.
Yeah.
And then Undertale ran with it. And now you can't go anywhere without knowing who Undertale Sans is.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Right? I just wanted to say that. But like also like Undertale music is classic.
You just wanted to lie.
No, Undertale's everyone knows who Sans is. The funny skeleton man. Some people might know him like that, but still.
Yeah.
Right? But Undertale, like in terms of its music has been remixed so many times. I know people have heard Undertale music who don't know what Undertale is.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
People have made stories and like, I guess, alternate universes and fiction about the characters in Undertale because they liked the characters so much. Toby Fox knew what worked, honed in on what worked, and made it amazing.
Right.
Right? So how has games developed? Well, let's find these key aspects that make games good and work with those aspects to make them better. Right? And like Vi, do you have any like examples of this, of like seeing how games have developed using some of the classics? There's also the question of what games didn't work, what games don't exist anymore. Why don't they?
I was just thinking about like the original Zelda because I went back and played it, and then I think what was it that got re-released on Switch as the little claymation guy?
Link's Awakening?
Link's Awakening, right? But if you go back and play the original one, right, they're very different games from like a lot of the later Legend of Zelda, right? And you have to go back to like, well, they went for simplistic. They were like, there's a little guy and he's gonna go save the girl. That's also Mario, right? Like you go back to very simple themes, and then when you look at modern games that you enjoy, they come from the development of classics. So I kind of want to answer the question at the heart of this is, should you go back and play classics? No. That's my hot take. You don't have to, right? If you want to, go for it. But I don't think you need to actively play it to understand why the games that you like were developed from those.
That might be true, but I'm still going to hold that I think you should go back and play these classics. Even try them to get an understanding of what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah.
Like, I have a point here on, you can see what worked and didn't work and how to develop from there, and you can see, like, good mechanics and very easily see bad mechanics. Yeah. Let me give a point here. Imagine still grinding in games like it was the old Final Fantasies.
Yeah, would be
right?
bad.
Imagine not having save points during dungeons, having to complete an entire dungeon in one shot, or you have to restart from your last save. Especially if you die, right? Or here's one that I think you might not have experienced. Games used to have realistic inventory management. You had to choose which pocket your items went in and if they fit.
Bad.
Why would you do that, right?
Yeah. I do appreciate that about Baldur's Gate 3. And they keep making inventory improvements, which I am really grateful for. Yeah.
Right? Imagine having to backtrack through the whole game to get a single item with no changes. That used to be a huge thing.
Yeah.
Artificially increasing game length, right? Imagine Persona without the ability to interact with your classmates and build those bonds.
Yeah.
They added that in Persona 3.
Yeah.
That's not even that long ago. That was 2009.
I mean, yeah.
Right? I think you might be right in that we don't need to play the old games, but understanding why certain things were removed is fundamentally important, right? And even just asking yourself what mechanics used to exist and didn't work, and then looking it up on, I don't know, Reddit, like having people discuss it.
Yeah.
You'll really catch into these aspects.
This is my point. You don't need to play them. You can go understand their development, their evolution, what made them good and bad by, by going and doing some research. You don't have to play the game to have that understanding, right?
Though if you're making games,
maybe you should.
Maybe,
yeah, if you're going to, here's the thing. If you're going to go write a fantasy novel, maybe go read Lord of the Rings, right? If you're gonna write something dystopian, go read 1984. Right?
Yeah, go read The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, go engage with it. I'm not saying you have to finish it, right?
I've never been able to finish Dante's Inferno, but I still read through a lot of it.
Yeah, and you can understand main points. I've never read Don Quixote, but I would like to.
It'd
right?
be fun.
It'd be fun.
It's cool theoretically. It's hard to read.
Theoretically, but some things are difficult to read because we don't live in those worlds anymore, right? Again, and classic games has the added problem of not like a language barrier, but just consoles.
Development barrier.
Yeah, development barrier. It was like, hey, if you want to play that game in the way that it was like intended to be played, you have to go get that console. You have to go find a vintage copy of that game, which is deeply challenging.
Though on the show, we can't encourage emulation as a concept. It does exist.
Yeah.
If you go about it legally, there are ways to legally do emulation, and if you as a player can go about it legally, there are ways to access these old games if you want to see what they were like. Again, follow the law of your respective region, right? But it is true. It is hard to access some of these old games. There's a lack of compatibility. There's often bad graphics, bad music. Remember all these old mechanics I said were bad? Yeah.
Hey,
those old ones didn't remove them yet.
Do you remember when I DNF'd Skyward Sword because it was re-released for the Switch and I still hated it?
It was still bad.
It was still bad.
I haven't started it yet.
You know
I
what?
bought it from you like 3 years ago. I still haven't started.
Still bad. Anyway, it hasn't gotten better in the 3 years it's been in its little plastic box.
Yeah.
Anyway, so if you're gonna go play those games, definitely do it.
Yeah.
Right? Or wait till it's emulated or not emulated, but re-released on a console that you actually have.
Yeah.
Right? Go play the modern version of Tetris.
Yeah.
Right?
Or,
you don't have to go play the arcade version.
Yeah, and if you don't want to play Earthbound, maybe go play Undertale, a game that is so heavily inspired by it. You'll get those same core aspects, right? Pick the game that everybody who likes the classic one says is the most faithful remake of it and go play that. But I do have one more question that I'd like to ask for this show. We have about 20 minutes left going through the episode, but this one is, I think, a big one for me, even though my notes on it are quite short. How does playing the classics make modern games more fun?
I would love to say that you can appreciate the evolution, and you the most basic answer to this is you can be like, thank goodness we're not here anymore.
Me when I go back to play the old Legend of Zelda games.
Right? Like thank goodness we're not doing this.
Yeah, I feel like that with old Pokemon too. I feel that I play a lot of retro games quite often. I really enjoy it. And yeah.
It's really different when you open something like even opening Skyrim and then opening Baldur's Gate 3 is like
night and day.
Night and day, and they're not that far apart.
Yeah.
Right? But am I going to go back and play all of Skyrim? Maybe. Possibly.
With mods.
With mods.
With mods.
For kicks. Maybe. Perhaps. Or maybe I will not do that because one of those games is a little bit more fun today.
Yeah.
Right? But here's the thing. Here's the nostalgia piece, right? A couple of years from now, I'm going to be like, you know how good Baldur's Gate 3 was? I'm going to go play that again. Even with its, at that point, maybe retro graphics, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
imagine that being, I don't like saying that, imagine Baldur's Gate 3 will be retro one day.
Yes.
Oh.
But you'll still play it for the nostalgia, even though there's other things that have come out. So
things that might be better.
Should you play retro games? If you really liked it when it first came out, go play it again. That was a game you liked. Great.
You probably will still like it.
Yeah. If you're playing the modern version of it now and you're like, should I go play the original? I mean, you can. You just need to know that it's going to lack maybe some elements that you like now, some quality of life stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, one thing I've written here is, like, a common reason to read old books is they give you a new respect for what you read today. Like we were just saying with games.
Yeah.
They show you how tropes developed, and you can see how these tropes have been modified in newer, successful books. You start to see these references of how fun it is that people are denying these old tropes, right?
Yeah.
That they start going down the road of the trope and then switch it up. And that gives, like, this feeling of enjoyment of you predict what's going to happen, and now the creator has a new way of giving you a fun experience.
Yeah.
Right? It also gives you a sense of time and growth and what we were used to be limited by and how we've overcome it.
You can also appreciate craft. I think when you go back and read classic books, really different grammar structures, right? Really different way of presenting information.
Every sentence was so intensely loaded.
Yes.
Right? So meaningful.
Hey, Hemingway and your run-on sentences, we have to have some chats.
I would write like Hemingway if I wrote.
That's fun.
Don't read my books.
Right? But here's the thing. You can learn those voices. That's important. You can learn the way those stories are told. And that could inform, even if it's just like, you know what, I'm going to have a character who speaks like Hemingway writes. That's interesting. That's
Yeah.
a cool
Hell,
way to comment on that.
Baldur's Gate 3 has a character who speaks like Shakespeare. They have Volo,
Yeah.
right? Which if you play a lot of D&D, Volo is a reference to Volo's Guide to Everything and
Yeah.
a lot of other material you can access. And you know how I mention every time I run a D&D game, I open with the line of you can read the old books, but like all the like books that have been created for D&D and campaign books and everything. You can read all of it except for the campaign we're currently doing, right? And I say, but keep in mind that these books, like the Monsters Manual, would have been in your world, would have been found in libraries written by people who might not have been the most reliable sources, right? What if the last person who saw a beholder suffered brain trauma from that encounter and barely remembers it? What if they were lying about having found it because they wanted the reward from the king?
What if it's just removed by time?
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm going to call myself out here. I really enjoyed the Patrick O'Brien series, which is the Aubrey Maturin series. It's like Age of Sail, Napoleonic Wars, like American Revolution time period in the British Navy. And in the one I'm like reading right now, it takes them a couple of weeks to learn that America's declared war. Right? And it's because it's just like, oh, we were on a ship and now we're on a different ship and they just got the mail. Right? And that's dated a month ago. Right? It just takes time for stuff to travel. And if you think that that's a good way to run a campaign, very cool. Right? You just need to be upfront with those understandings.
Yeah. What I was going to say is Volo as a character in Baldur's Gate 3 is the epitome of that, of the unreliable writer, the unreliable narrator who inserts details about dragons because he wants there to be dragons because, quote, dragons make every story better.
Yeah, that is, I do really appreciate him for that.
Right?
Yeah.
But that adds like this level of, okay, if you've read Volo's Guide to Everything as a book and then you see that character, you're like, this guy was faking.
Yeah, exactly. But it makes a lot of sense in context, right?
Yeah, but it makes it also more fun to interact with.
Yeah, and I love the idea of taking stories and things that people expect and making them different, right? Volo's Guide to Everything. Oh, he's a really informed guy, right? He's really
not in the slightest.
Not even a little bit. That story he told, wrong.
Made it all up for dramatic flair.
Yeah. Fizban's Treasury of Dragons is canon written by Bahamut, disguised as a researcher. Like he genuinely, there's little like comments in that book that are like from Fizban, and he's like talking about stuff. He's like, oh, these dragons this and these dragons this, and then it like through reading those comments and the comments that he makes about the sections written about Bahamut, it's like, oh, that's you.
That's you.
Yeah.
Right? But kind of talking about other games as well, right? Getting an idea for how games developed and how they were limited and how they've grown and how much we can do today, you gain a lot of respect for the games that you're playing, right? I remember playing through Persona 4, and I'm not going to lie, having played through all of Persona 4, the original version, none of the updated graphics, none of the new stuff that they're doing with it, right? They are currently remaking Persona 4 with the Persona 5 social system, which, oh, thank God, because I played through Persona 4 and suffered. But like having played through it, I did interact with the social system and the god-awful voice actors, right? Well, not voice actors, god-awful voice acting of 2011,
sure,
right? And I interacted with the randomly generated dungeons, but also like the cool personas and the developments of characters and these themes of mystery and this deep story.
Yeah.
Then I played Persona 5 afterwards, and the sigh of relief every time they introduced a new concept. Like, my friend group was laughing their asses off at me.
I was just thinking about this as like operating systems, right? Like I have like my last phone, right, which hasn't been updated, right? And opening that and then being like, oh man, what is this? Is very familiar to like retro gaming, right? It's like, why is it like that? It's like, well, because that was the best we had. That was what you got, you know?
Yeah, and Persona 4 was still fun to play.
Oh, yeah.
That being said, they've recently remade Persona 3. I will not play it until the full remake is done and not $90 because
that's an expensive game.
It is an expensive game. It's not. It doesn't even have the original DLC. They're still remaking that, I think. But like,
that's wild.
Like, I will not go play the old Persona 3 because having played the old Persona 4, I have every intent to play every Persona game, all of them. Shin Megami Tensei Persona,
yes,
Shin Megami Tensei What If, which is the game before Persona, then Shin Megami Tensei Persona, which is the first. Shin Megami Tensei, actually, it wasn't called Shin Megami Tensei. It was Persona 2 Eternal Sin. Persona 2, whatever the other one was. There's Eternal Sin and IR, whatever it was. There's 2 Persona 2 games. Infrared. I'm looking it up now. But like, there's 2 Persona 2 games. Innocent Sin is the first one, and Eternal Punishment. There we go. Mix them up, right? Which, by the way, one of those games retcons the other. Just nightmare. And I will play Persona 3, and I will play Persona 4, and I will play the side games, because fun fact, every side game in the Persona series is canon. I'm going to cry. There's no non-canon material in the entire Persona universe. The dancing game is canon. But I will play them, because I love Persona, and I want to see how it's grown, and I want to gain that respect for it. It's hard.
Yeah.
But then when I play Persona 5, every time I do, I just kind of like sink into a puddle with how much I love that game.
Yes.
Right? Because it's so fun.
Yeah.
Right?
So playing games that came before a game you love can make you appreciate the thing you like more.
Oh, yeah.
Which is great. This is how this is the same thing about like anything that you... I was talking with a friend of mine who is a creative person in the film industry in Vancouver, and talking about there are, the reason that they went into film being that they loved movies so much, right? And then talking about films that we loved, and does it ruin your love of something to learn about how it was made?
Right.
Or does it make it more important?
Right.
And the answer is that I can only watch Master and Commander so many times before I stop noticing details, right? At some point, there's no more details for me to notice, right? I've seen it a lot. But if I go read about how it was made, the fact that they...
Watch behind the scenes,
read the book they made on how they made the movie, right? If I go back and I engage with the original source material, which are the Patrick O'Brian novels, or I go learn about Nelson's Navy, I'm going to notice so much more in the thing that I already love. And that's the important thing.
You will love it more deeply.
You don't love something less by learning more about it.
Yeah. Remember our depth versus complexity? You're gaining even more of that depth, right?
Man, that
episode always comes back.
Keystone.
Keystone. Right? And I also want to just put on the side, like, by playing these old games, you do also gain access to all of the Easter eggs, all of the references, all of the knowledge of how these things have grown, and like,
again,
people talking about
things
that.
To notice, right? It's going into temples in Breath of the Wild and being like, oh, this music is from somewhere else. I recognize it now. They just took pieces
they remixed it.
Yeah.
Right?
Or they fragmented it, right? So it feels broken. Whoa.
Yeah. Like, this is how we know that the old Persona games are canon, by the way. Persona 3 had the original characters from 1 and 2, like, as side people you could talk to. Persona 4 had posters of the characters from 3, and one of your main guides mentions them. Persona 5, for example... one of the main characters in Persona 4 is an actor named Rize. Mm-hmm. And in Persona 5, if you turn on the TV on one of the days in the game, she's on screen doing like like talking about one of her performances.
Oh, cool.
She's canon in Persona 5. Yeah. And in Persona 4, she was my favorite character.
Cool.
Which means I turn on the TV and I see her and
you're like, yay!
Yeah. No, out loud with my friend group. I was like, guys, my favorite character's here.
My favorite character's here. Yeah.
I was like freaking out.
They're not playable, but they're here.
They're here. They're canon.
Yes.
This is the same world. It's only a few years later.
That's my
Canonically, it's 3 years later.
That's my favorite little guy.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah. The phrase favorite little guy or just little guy has done a lot for modern slang.
It's done a lot for your slang specifically. you just have the little guy brain rot.
I have the little guy brain rot. They're just my blorbo from my shows, I
can't believe blorbo has also influenced your brain rot, apparently.
My look, sometimes you realize that you have your own way of speaking, and it's wonderful to learn where you got things from. Mm-hmm. Right? Why do I know that phrase? It's my own personal little Easter egg from my development. Do I want to go back and relive my 2019? No.
Do I want to go back to 2016? Dear God, no.
No. Do I need to go relive 2013? No. But did it inform who I am today? Well, yeah.
Do I want to maybe go back and read things I read back then because I loved them then and I love them now?
Yeah. Do I want to go back to when I first cracked open my crisp Percy Jackson book? Absolutely. My copy of the
I love your enunciation, just crisp.
Crisp. My copy of The Lightning Thief? Battered. just, and I don't
My
mean,
copy on an Apple iPod Touch stuffed in a bin in my
oh
parents'
my
house.
god,
'Cause I got
that's
it on.
so fun.
It's the only digital book I've ever bought.
I had the first one as paper, and then I had the rest of them on an iPad, and then I had the last one as a hardcover.
What?
Yeah,
I'm taking damage just from hearing that.
I know. So I don't have a complete collection. I just have the first one
And the last one.
and the last one, and the last
In two different forms.
The last one's in great shape, and the first one, when I say battered, I don't mean like fish and chips battered. I mean like was put through a washing machine.
Chips battered. So, okay. So I'm going to give a summary of the episode we've gone
digress
through.
into this nonsense.
I'm going to give a summary of what we've gone through.
Mm-hmm.
Why, in my opinion, in our opinion, should you go play the old games or play the things that are so fundamentally inspired by them that they give you the same aspects, right? Why should you go back and study the classics, right? It helps us to make better modern games, right? You get to understand why did the battle royale genre get big? It's not the collabs, it's this anxiety of having a single life and of hunting for items and against 100 other people. It's the Hunger Games. Like, battle royale games are the Hunger Games, right? It's knowing that Pokemon is all about these silly little guys and Minecraft is about the creativity, not about being in the wild, right? And it's knowing like Baldur's Gate 3 is good because of the character development, not because of the thousands of items, which if you procedurally generate these items, let's say as like a developer who can't make thousands of unique items, it's going to suck.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how it is, right? It also helps you understand how games have changed over time and gives you that deep respect for games, right? You get to say, man, it's great that I don't have to play the same dungeon 3 times in a row to get to a high enough level to beat the boss.
Yeah.
Me in Persona 4.
Wow.
I
Terrible mechanic.
I actually straight up did not have to do that. I did it because I was a coward. And
you went back and played the dungeon because you were like, the boss is too scary.
I would do the whole dungeon and get to the boss, teleport to the beginning, do the whole thing again, and then fight the boss for every dungeon. And that's why I didn't finish the last dungeon. The DLC dungeon, I should say. I didn't beat the game. But it tells you, like, why, like, did Pokemon remove the underground and the diving and all those mazes and the day-night cycle, the contest, the battle mansions, right? Like, why was Undertale so focused on music and silly character interactions and not much on their battles, right? You get answers to these questions. You get to see what makes games good. It's why we make this podcast, for the love of games, right? What makes them good? Why can we talk about them now? And above all, it makes playing games more fun. The more games you play, the more fun you get to have with these games. And like with books, it's hard to play a game today that will become a classic that you know will stand the test of time when 1,000 games come out every day.
Yeah,
right?
Really, really hard to parse everything that comes out to find the thing that's going to be defining for this.
We got lucky with Baldur's Gate 3 because it was so good that it was, you know, it's going to be a classic. But with many other games, that's not obvious. That's not obvious with Persona. It really wasn't. Persona wasn't a classic till 2 years later. Right? It's hard to tell sometimes. Minecraft took like 5 years to catch on.
Yeah.
Right?
Or it's stuff like hey, what's the computer game where you die of dysentery all the time?
Oh, Oregon Trail?
Yes. It's stuff like Oregon Trail, right? Bad game, mostly, right? Text-based, right? You're going to die a lot of dysentery.
Just incredibly hard.
Right? But it was really fun for the time it came out because it was new and different.
Yeah.
It's hard to know
and
what's
the basis of the survival genre.
It's hard to know what's new and different now, right? What is coming out that's going to be, you know, the foundation thing for a genre that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah. How many people have played Mega Man as a game series? Despite the fact that that was a classic and was defining, why did it die off? I have the answer to that question, having played a lot of Mega Man games. Ugh.
Yeah. Think about how many, like, beefy fantasy books there are, right? Which one of those is going to be, like, you know...
Which one is worth the slog?
Worth the slog. So hard to know. Right, and there's so much.
But you could go read Lord of the Rings.
You could go read Lord of the Rings, but with the knowledge that it's not a modern fantasy book.
Yeah.
It's the first one.
And then
right?
knowing what's good, you can go look at the modern books and say, which ones of these are really using these good aspects?
Yeah,
and it would work. It overall, my personal opinion, even if you only play a little bit or play the spiritual successors or the remakes, go play some of the classics. Go figure out what makes games good, and go play good games. Get that knowledge and use that knowledge to play better games. That's the whole motto of the show, to play better games.
Play better games. And, you know, and important that they are games that you like. as
yes.
an individual.
If you
right?
don't like it, well, now you know a bit why.
If everybody's like, this game is good, and you don't like playing it, that's fine. That's okay. You don't have to do a deep dive into its spiritual successors or its foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that covers everything. So go play the classics, and thank you for listening to us talk about them for 55 minutes.
Wow.
So, I've been Gaia.
And I've been Vi.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
And that's it for today's episode. But what if you wanted to listen to more? Well, our new episodes come out every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic, and there are 3 different ways that you can listen. If you're in the Fredericton area of New Brunswick, Canada, you can listen live on CHSR 97.9 FM through any of your radio services. If you're not in this region or you prefer using the internet, you can tune in on chsrfm.ca at the same time, 9 p.m. Atlantic. As well, we release all of our episodes on a number of podcasting platforms online, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. So if you wanted to, you could go back right now and listen to Season 1, where Vi and I do a deep dive into the fundamental concepts of game design, rather than the hardware they'll be taking up this season. Anyways, thank you for listening, and have a good one. Okay, I'm turning on the recording quickly to do a sound test. Would you be able to pop over to your mic and give me some sounds?
Wow. Give you some sounds is a wow. Oh, I know what I can do.